Bhagavan Sri Ramana never sought of his own accord to teach anyone the truth that he had come to know, because in his experience that truth, the consciousness I am, alone exists, and hence there is no person either to give or to receive any teaching. However, though he inwardly knew that consciousness is the only reality, he was nevertheless outwardly a personification of love, compassion, and kindness, because, knowing both himself and all other things to be nothing but the consciousness I am, he saw himself in everything, and hence he quite literally loved all living beings as his own self. Therefore, when people asked him questions about reality and the means of attaining it, he patiently answered their questions, and thus, without any volition on his part, he gradually revealed a wealth of spiritual teachings. Many of the answers that he thus gave were recorded in writing, more or less accurately by his devotees and disciples, but the most accurate and authentic record of his teachings lies in the poetry that he himself wrote, mostly in Tamil and also in Sanskrit, Telugu, and Malayalam. Most of the poetry he wrote was in response to requests made by his disciples, but some of it was composed by him spontaneously. His poetry falls into two general categories: poems that directly convey spiritual teachings, and devotional hymns that convey spiritual teachings indirectly in the allegorical language of mystical love. Since he was asked questions on a wide range of subjects by people whose interest and level of understanding varied greatly, the answers that he gave were in each case tailored to the needs of the person he was talking to, and hence they did not always reflect the essence of his teachings. Therefore, when we read the various records of the conversations that he had with people, they may appear to contain inconsistencies, and to convey no single, clear, or coherent set of teachings. However, a very clear, coherent, and consistent account of his central teachings can be found in his poetry and other writings. And if we read all the records of his conversations in the light of those central teachings, we can clearly understand that he had a very definite message for all who were ready to hear it. Before he attained the experience of true self-knowledge, Sri Ramana had not read or heard anything that described that experience, or prepared him in any way for it. Having been brought up in a normal family of South Indian Brahmins, he was familiar with the outward forms of the Hindu religion and with a few devotional texts, and having been educated in a Christian missionary school, he was familiar with the outward forms of Christianity and with the Bible. Moreover, having had some childhood friends who were from Muslim families, he also had some familiarity with the outward forms of Islam. But though he had a general idea that all these religions were just different ways of worshiping the same one God, he had had no opportunity to learn anything about the real inner essence that lies behind the outward forms of all religions. The teachings that he gave in later years were therefore derived entirely from his own inward experience, and did not originate from any outward learning. However, whenever anyone asked him to explain any sacred or spiritual text, he would read it, and would often recognize that in one way or another it was expressing the truth that was his own experience. Thus he was able to interpret such texts with authority, and to explain their inner meaning in clear and simple words. Since the cultural and religious milieu in which he lived was predominantly Hindu, and since most of the people who sought his spiritual guidance were either born Hindus or were familiar with traditional Hindu philosophy, the texts he was most often asked to explain were those of the Hindu philosophical tradition known as Advaita Vedanta. Thus, Sri Ramana's teachings are often identified with Advaita Vedanta and are taken to be a modern expression or interpretation of that ancient philosophy. The word Vedanta literally means the conclusion or end, anta, or knowledge, Veda, and denotes the philosophical conclusions of the Vedas. These philosophical conclusions are contained in Vedic texts known as the Upanishads, and were later expressed more clearly and in greater detail in two other ancient texts known as the Brahma Sutra and the Bhagavad Gita. These three bodies of literature, which are known as the triple source, Prasthana Traya of Vedanta, have been interpreted in various ways, giving rise to three distinct systems of Vedantic philosophy: the pure monistic system, known as Advaita, the dualistic system, known as Advaita, and the qualified monistic system, known as Visishta Advaita. Of these three systems of philosophy, Advaita is not only the most radical, but also the least convoluted interpretation of the ancient Prasthana Traya of Vedanta, and hence it is widely recognized as being Vedanta in its purest and truest form. However, Advaita is more than just a scholarly interpretation of some ancient text. Like the literature of any other system of religious or spiritual philosophy, the literature of Advaita includes a huge amount of elaborate and abstruse material, written by and for scholars, but such material is not the essence or basis of the Advaita philosophy. The life and heart of Advaita Vedanta lies in a number of crucial texts that contain the sayings and writings of sages like Sri Ramana, who had attained true self-knowledge, and whose words therefore reflect their own direct experience of the reality. Thus, Advaita Vedanta is a system of spiritual philosophy that is based not upon mere reasoning or intellectual speculation, but upon the experience of sages who have attained direct knowledge of the non-dual reality that underlies the appearance of all multiplicity. The word Advaita literally means no two-ness or non-duality, and denotes the truth experienced by sages, the truth that the reality is only one, a single undivided whole that is completely devoid of any duality or multiplicity. According to sages who have attained true self-knowledge, all multiplicity is a mere appearance, a distorted view of the one reality, like the illusory appearance of a snake seen in a dim light. Just as the reality underlying the illusory appearance of the snake is just a rope lying on the ground, so the reality underlying the illusory appearance of multiplicity is only the non-dual consciousness of being that we each experience as I am. Sri Ramana's teachings are therefore identified with Advaita Vedanta for three main reasons. Firstly, because he experienced and taught the same non-dual reality that was experienced by the sages whose sayings and writings formed the foundation of the Advaita Vedanta philosophy. Secondly, because he was often asked to explain and elucidate various texts from the classical literature of Advaita Vedanta. And thirdly, because in his teachings, he made free but nevertheless selective use of the terminology, concepts, and analogies used in that classical literature. The reason he thus used the terminology and concepts of Advaita Vedanta more than those of any other spiritual tradition, such as Buddhism, Taoism, Jewish or Christian mysticism, or Sufism, is that most of the people who sought his spiritual guidance were more familiar with Advaita Vedanta than with those other spiritual traditions, and hence it was easier for them to understand such terminology and concepts. However, whenever anyone asked him to elucidate any text or passage from the literature of those other spiritual traditions, he did so with the same ease, clarity, and authority that he elucidated the text of the Advaita Vedanta. Though in his teachings Sri Ramana borrowed some of the terminology, concepts, and analogies commonly used in the classical literature of Advaita Vedanta, his teachings are not merely a repetition of the old and familiar teachings contained in that literature, because he was teaching the truth that he had known from his own direct experience and not merely learnt from books. He was able to set aside all the dense mass of non-essential, complex, and ponderous arguments and concepts found in that literature and to throw a fresh and clear light upon the inner essence of Advaita Vedanta. In his teachings, he has revealed the true spirit of Advaita Vedanta in a clear and simple manner that can easily be understood, even by people who have no previous experience with such philosophy. Moreover, the simplicity and clarity and directness of his teachings have helped to clear the confusion created in the minds of many people who have studied the classical literature of Advaita Vedanta, but have been misled by the many well-established and misinterpretations of it made by scholars who have had no direct experience of the truth. In particular, his teachings have cleared up many misunderstandings that had long existed about the practice of Advaita Vedanta, and have clearly revealed the means by which we can attain the experience of true self-knowledge. Since the means to attain self-knowledge is for some reason seldom stated in clear and unambiguous terms in the classical literature of Advaita Vedanta, many misconceptions exist about the spiritual practice advocated by Advaita Vedanta. Therefore, perhaps the most significant contribution made by Sri Ramana to the literature of Advaita Vedanta lies in the fact that in his teachings he has revealed in very clear, precise, and unambiguous terms the practical means by which self-knowledge can be attained. Not only has he explained this practical means very clearly, he has also explained exactly how it will lead us infallibly to the state of self-knowledge, and why it is the only means that can do so. Unlike many of the older texts of Advaita Vedanta, the teachings of Sri Ramana are centered entirely around the practical means by which we can attain self-knowledge, and all that he taught regarding any aspect of life was aimed solely at directing our minds toward this practice. Though this practical means is essentially very simple, for many people it appears difficult to comprehend, because it is not an action or state of doing, nor does it involve any form of objective attention, since the practice is thus a state beyond all mental activity, a state of non-doing and non-objective attention. No words can express it perfectly. Therefore, to enable us to understand and practice it, Sri Ramana has expressed and described it in various different ways, each of which serves as a valuable clue that helps us to know and to be the pure consciousness that is our own true self. Sri Ramana spoke and wrote mostly in Tamil, his mother tongue, but he was also conversant in Sanskrit, Telugu, and Malayalam, and English. Tamil is the oldest surviving member of the Dravidian family of languages and has a rich and ancient classical literature, though in its origins it belongs to a family of languages that is entirely independent of the Indo-European family. For the past 2,000 years or so, Tamil literature has made rich and abundant use of words borrowed from Sanskrit, the oldest surviving member of the Indo-European family. Therefore, most of the terms Sri Ramana used to describe the practical means by which we can attain self-knowledge are either Tamil words or words of Sanskrit origin that are commonly used in Tamil spiritual literature. The words he thus used in Tamil have been translated in English by a variety of different words, some of which convey the import and spirit of his original words more clearly and accurately than others. Perhaps two of the clearest and most simple terms used in English to convey the sense of the words that he used in Tamil to describe the practical means to attain self-knowledge are self-attention and self-abidance. The term self-attention denotes the knowing aspect of the practice, while the term self-abidance denotes its being aspect. Since our real self, which is non-dual self-consciousness, knows itself not by an act of knowing but merely by being itself, the state of our knowing our real self is just the state of being our real self. Thus, attending to our self-consciousness and abiding as our self-consciousness are one and the same thing. All the other words that Sri Ramana used to describe the practice are intended to be clues that help to clarify what this state of self-attention or self-abidance really is. A few of the terms which he used to describe the practice of self-attention or self-abidance are in fact terms already used in some of the classical texts of Advaita Vedanta. However, though such texts have used some of the same terms that Sri Ramana used to express the practice, they have seldom explained the true import of those terms in a clear and unambiguous manner. Thus, even after thoroughly studying the classical literature of Advaita Vedanta, many people are left with only a vague understanding of what they can do to attain self-knowledge. As a result, many misconceptions about the practice of Advaita Vedanta arose, and some of these misconceptions have been prevalent among students and scholars of Advaita Vedanta since time immemorial. One of the terms that occurs in the classical literature of Advaita Vedanta and that Sri Ramana frequently used to denote the practice of self-attention is vichara. But the significance of this term was not clearly understood by most of the traditional scholars of Advaita Vedanta. According to the Sanskrit-English dictionary of Monier Williams, the term vichara has various meanings, including pondering, deliberation, consideration, reflection, examination, investigation. And it is in these senses that this same word is used in Tamil, as is clear from the Tamil lexicon, which defines it both as deliberation or consideration, and as unbiased examination with a view to arriving at the truth or investigation. Therefore, the term Atma vichara, which Sri Ramana frequently used to describe the practice by which we can attain self-knowledge, means self-investigation or self-examination, and denotes the practice of examining, inspecting, or scrutinizing our fundamental and essential consciousness, I am, with a keen and concentrated power of attention. Though the term Atma vichara can best be translated in English as self-investigation, self-examination, self-inspection, self-scrutiny, self-contemplation, or simply self-attention, in most English translations of Sri Ramana's teachings, it has been translated as self-inquiry. This choice of the English word inquiry to translate vichara has had unfortunate consequences, because it has created an impression in the minds of some people that Atma vichara, or the vichara who am I, as Sri Ramana often called it, is merely a process of questioning or asking ourselves, who am I? This is clearly a misinterpretation, because in Sanskrit the word vichara means inquiry in the sense of investigation, rather than in the sense of questioning. When Sri Ramana spoke of the vichara, who am I, he did not intend it to imply that we can attain the non-dual experience of true self-knowledge simply by asking ourselves the question, who am I? The vichara, who am I, is an investigation, examination, or scrutiny of our fundamental consciousness, I am, because only by keenly scrutinizing or inspecting our consciousness, I, can we discover who we really are, what this consciousness, I, actually is. Besides describing the means to attain self-knowledge, by the use of the terms that mean self-attention or self-abidance, Sri Ramana also described it by terms that mean self-surrender or self-denial. By using the latter terms, he affirmed that the ultimate aim of all forms of dualistic devotion, devotion to a God who is conceived as other than the devotee, is in fact the non-dual state of true self-knowledge. In order to know our true self, we must give up our identification with the false individual self that we now mistake to be I. Therefore, surrendering or denying our personal self, our mind, which is our confused and distorted consciousness, I am this body, a person called so-and-so, is essential if we are to know our true, unadulterated consciousness, I am, which is our real self. Our individual self, which is the limited and distorted consciousness that we call our mind or ego, and that in theological terminology is called our soul, nourishes its seeming existence by attending to things other than itself. When we cease attending to other things, as in sleep, our mind or individual self subsides. But as soon as we begin to think of other things, it again rises and flourishes. Without thinking of things other than I, our mind cannot stand. Therefore, when we attempt to turn our attention away from all objects and towards our fundamental consciousness I, we are surrendering or denying our individual self, our mind or ego. Self-attention or self-abidance is thus the perfect means to attain the state of self-surrender or self-denial. That is why in verse 31 of Viveka Chudamani, Sri Adi Shankara defines bhakti or devotion as sva, svarupa, anusandhana, or self-attention, the investigation or close inspection of our own true form or essential nature, which is our fundamental self-consciousness, our non-dual consciousness of our own being, I am. Sri Ramana expresses the same truth in verse 15 of Upadesa Dhanip Bhaktal, but at the same time explains why it is so. Since God exists as Atma, our essential spirit or real self, Atma Anusandhana, self-investigation, self-inspection, or self-attention, is Parama Isa Bhakti, supreme devotion to God. He also expresses a similar idea in the 13th paragraph of his brief treatise Nan Yar, Who Am I? Being completely absorbed in Atmanishta, self-abidance, the state of just being, as we really are, giving not even the slightest room to the rising of any thought other than the Atma Chintana, the thought of our own real self, is giving ourselves to God. People who practice dualistic devotion believe that the highest form of devotion to God, the purest form of love, is to surrender ourselves wholly to Him. In order to surrender themselves to Him, they try to deny themselves by giving up their attachment to all that they consider as mine, and in particular, by renouncing their own individual will. Thus, the ultimate prayer of every true devotee is, Thy will be done, not my will, but only Thine. However, so long as the mind exists, it will inevitably have a will of its own. Desire and attachment are inherent in the mind, the very fabric of which it is made. Therefore, so long as we feel ourselves to be an individual I, we will also have an individual will, and will feel a sense of attachment to mine. The only way we can surrender our own will and give up all our attachments is to surrender the mind that has an individual will and feels attachment to the body and other possessions. Trying to surrender our individual will and sense of mind, our desires and attachments, without actually surrendering our individuality, our ego or sense of being a separate I, is like cutting the leaves and branches off a tree without cutting its root. Until and unless we cut the root, the branches and leaves will continue sprouting again and again. Similarly, until and unless we surrender our ego, the root of all our desires and attachments, all our efforts to give up our desires and attachments will fail, because they will continue to sprout again and again into one subtle form or another. Therefore, self-surrender can be complete and final only when our individual self, the limited consciousness that we call our mind or ego, is surrendered wholly. So long as we feel that we exist as an individual who is separate from God, we have not surrendered ourselves wholly to Him. Though we are in truth only the pure, unlimited, and non-personal consciousness I am, which is the spirit or true form of God, we feel that we are separate from Him, because we mistake ourselves to be a limited, individual consciousness that has identified itself with a particular body. This individual consciousness, our feeling, I am a person, a separate individual, a mind or soul confined within the limits of a body, is merely an imagination, a false and distorted form of our pure consciousness I am, but it is nevertheless the root cause of all desire and all misery. Unless we give up this individual consciousness, this false notion that we are separate from God, we can never be free of desire nor of misery, which is the inevitable consequence of desire. True self-surrender is therefore nothing but giving up the false notion that we are separate from God. In order to give up this false notion, we must know who we really are. And in order to know who we really are, we must attend to the consciousness that we feel to be I. Though the consciousness that we now feel to be I is only a false consciousness, a limited and distorted form of the real consciousness that is God, by attending to it keenly, we can know the real consciousness that underlies it. That is, attending keenly to this false form of consciousness is similar to looking closely at a snake that we imagine we see lying on the ground in the dim light of dusk. When we look closely at the snake, we discover that it is in fact nothing but a rope. Similarly, if we keenly attend to the limited and distorted individual consciousness that we now feel to be I, we will discover that it is in fact nothing but the real and unlimited consciousness I am, which is God. Just as the illusory appearance of the snake dissolves and disappears as soon as we see the rope, so the illusory feeling that we are a separate individual consciousness confined within the limits of a body will dissolve and disappear as soon as we experience the pure, non-dual consciousness, which is the reality both of ourself and of God. We can thus achieve complete and perfect self-surrender only by knowing oneself to be the real consciousness that is devoid of all duality and separateness. Without knowing our true self, we cannot surrender our false self, and without surrendering our false self, we cannot know our true self. Self-surrender and self-knowledge are thus inseparable, like the two sides of one sheet of paper. In fact, the terms self-surrender and self-knowledge are just two ways of describing one and the same state, the pure, non-dual state of consciousness devoid of individuality. Since true self-knowledge is therefore the state in which our individual consciousness, our mind or ego, is known to be a false appearance that never existed except in its own imagination, Sri Ramana often described it as the state of egolessness, loss of individuality, or destruction of the mind. Another term that is commonly used both in Buddhism and in Advaita Vedanta to describe the state of annihilation or extinction of our personal identity is Nirvana, a word that literally means blown out or extinguished. This is the same state that most religions refer to as liberation or salvation, because only in this state of true self-knowledge are we free or safe from the bondage of mistaking ourselves to be a separate individual, a consciousness that is confined within the limits of a physical body. The sole reality that exists and is known in this state of egolessness, nirvana or salvation, is our fundamental and essential consciousness I am. Since it does not identify itself with any delimiting adjunct, our essential and pure consciousness I am is a single, undivided, and unlimited whole, separate from which nothing can exist. All the diversity and multiplicity that appears to exist so long as we identify ourselves with the physical body is known only by our mind, which is merely a distorted and limited form of our original consciousness I am. If this consciousness I am did not exist, nothing else could appear to exist. Therefore, our fundamental consciousness I am is the source and origin of all knowledge, the one basis of all that appears to exist. Our essential consciousness I am is thus the ultimate reality, the original source from which everything arises, and the final destination towards which all religions and spiritual traditions seek to lead us. Most religions call this fundamental reality God, or the Supreme Being, or else they refer to it in a more abstract manner as the true state of being. But by whatever name they may call it, and whether they describe it as a being or a state of being, the truth is that the supreme and absolute reality is not anything other than our own being, the consciousness which we experience as I am. In his true form, his essential nature, God is not something or some person who exists outside us or separate from us, but is the spirit or consciousness that exists within us as our own essential nature. God is the pure consciousness I am, the true form of consciousness that is not limited by identifying itself with the physical body or any other adjunct. But when we, who are that same pure consciousness I am, identify ourselves with the physical body, feeling I am this body, I am a person, an individual confined within the limits of time and space, we become the mind, a false and illusory form of consciousness. Because we identify ourselves with adjuncts in this manner, we seemingly separate ourselves from the adjunctless pure consciousness I am, which is God, by thus imagining ourselves to be an individual separate from God. We violate his unlimited wholeness and undivided oneness. The inner aim of all religions and spiritual traditions is to free us from this illusory state in which we imagine that we are separate from God, the one unlimited and undivided reality. For example, in Christianity, this state in which we violate the oneness and wholeness of God by imagining ourselves to be an individual separate from Him is called the original sin, which is the root cause of all misery and unhappiness. Because we become free from this original sin only by knowing the truth, Christ said, "Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." The truth that we must know in order to be made free is the truth that we are nothing but the adjunctless, pure consciousness I am, that I am which is the true form of God, as disclosed by Him when he revealed his identity to Moses, saying, I am that I am. To know the truth does not mean to know it theoretically, but to know it as a direct and immediate experience. In order to destroy the illusion that we are a limited individual consciousness, a person separate from the perfect whole which is called God, we must experience ourselves as the unlimited and undivided pure consciousness I am. Therefore, to know the truth and thereby be made free from the illusion called original sin, we must die and be born again. We must die to the flesh and be born again as the Spirit. That is why Christ said, Except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God. Except a man be born of the Spirit, he cannot enter into the kingdom of God. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. That is, to experience and enter into the true state of God, we must cease to exist as a separate individual, a consciousness that identifies itself with the flesh and all the limitations of the flesh, and must rediscover ourselves to be the unlimited and undivided spirit, the pure, unadulterated, and infinite consciousness I am, which is the absolute reality that we call God. When we identify ourselves with the body made of flesh, we become that flesh. But when we cease to identify ourselves with that flesh and know ourselves to be mere spirit, we are born again as our original nature, the pure spirit or consciousness I am. The need for us to sacrifice our individuality in order to be born anew as the Spirit is a recurring theme in the teachings of Jesus Christ. Except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. He that loveth his life shall lose it, and he that hateth his life in this world shall keep it unto life eternal. Whosoever shall seek to save his life shall lose it, and whosoever shall lose his life shall preserve it. And he that taketh not his cross and followeth after me is not worthy of me. He that findeth his life shall lose it, and he that loses his life for my sake shall find it. If man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. For what is a man profited, if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? That is, in order to rediscover our true and eternal life as the Spirit, we must lose our false and transient life as an individual. If we seek to preserve our false individuality, we shall in effect be losing our real spirit. This is the price we have to pay to live as an individual in this world. Therefore, whatever we may gain or achieve in this world, we do so at the cost of losing our real self, the state of perfection and wholeness, which in this context is what Christ means by the term, our own soul. In exchange for regaining our original and perfect state of wholeness, we have only to give up our individuality and all that goes with it, which is truly profitable, to lose the whole and gain merely a part, or to give up a mere part in exchange for the whole.